Ulysses has already initiated the missile launch, and should the courier still not understand why it is that Ulysses has gone through all this trouble, they'll get the most transparent scolding possible from Ulysses.
You've answered your own question, and you'll die with that question on your lips. You don't see, listen, even when it's all around you. No matter if I nailed it into your head like a gift from Caesar.
The answer is in the question. The courier doesn't understand. They failed to see, failed to listen, just as they unwittingly brought the destruction of the Divide so long ago via the package. Now too they have brought the destruction of the West via the very same machine used by the Divide to construct this seemingly inoffensive iBot. When told that what Ulysses is doing is madness compared to the failure of the courier, Ulysses' response is the verbal embodiment of the theme of Lonesome Road.
No. Now there is purpose. I believe you when you say you were careless. The Divide, the chip, the machine you brought here. Many messages can be taken from that, intended or not. What I do now is an act of conviction.
Now there is purpose. It's a strong illustration of why Ulysses is the antithesis to Courier 6, an incredible likeness to Caesar's very philosophy regarding conflict and the inevitability of war. From here, there are a handful of options for the player in how to resolve things with Ulysses. The first, simplest, and easiest to achieve is to simply kill him. Failure to convince Ulysses that what he is doing is wrong, or simply opting to attack him will lead to the final battle that, yeah, it's a little hard. Alright, so Ulysses has max special stats and skills, his health goes just over 1000, he has a damage threshold of 18, he possesses the Finesse perk which grants a 5% critical hit chance as well as Toughness for an additional 10% damage resistance, his Duster grants him 13 damage threshold as well as a bonus 5% critical hit chance, he has 2 Stealth Boys to stealthily flank the player when enough distance has been created between the two, he has a Flashbang which he'll typically utilize at the start of the battle to try and gain a quick upper hand on the player, 6 stim packs for healing as well as an additional medical iBot, a second iBot to help dish out additional damage, 3 uses of Med-X to further increase his damage resistance, 6 frag grenades, an anti-material rifle, a 12.7mm SMG, and his signature melee weapon, Old Glory. A melee weapon with a 50% boost in critical hit chance and critical hit damage that deals triple damage, rather than the usual double. The arena has a number of dips that lead into cover which can be useful for buying time to heal or even just reload. To the left and right are also paths to computers which can be hacked to disable Ulysses' iBots, preventing further respawning and taking both of his supports out. However, doing so requires either 100 in science or 100 in repair, though at this point if you haven't maxed either, I think it's fair to say that you've come here a bit underleveled. Oh, and the paths to these computers are also littered with powerful traps that will almost assuredly insta-kill the player. One could opt to just jump down to the computer, however doing so means having to backtrack through these traps so you can escape the disadvantage of low ground. Enemies can also be baited into triggering these traps, potentially killing them or even injuring Ulysses. Oh, and did I mention that the marked men will also begin storming in after a short period of time? Yeah, this shit ain't easy. On paper, I think the structure of the fight is sound. There's plenty of tertiary elements to consider while working towards the goal of taking down what is essentially a foil to the player character. That much I can respect, but the fight inevitably buckles somewhat under the underpolished combat of this game. Without VATS, this fight would be a fucking nightmare to try and deal with. Thankfully, it's not impossible to talk Ulysses out of fighting, though it is extremely difficult. In total, there's about 4 different means of talking him down. Speech checks, reputation, his holotapes, and through Edie. Of course, the player must continue to cooperate with him once he's been convinced, but by then it should be pretty apparent what dialogue will lead where. The first is as simple as it sounds, mechanically, that is. If you have 100 speech, you can remind him of the history between you two and convince him that all he's done is repeat the very mistakes that he condemns you for, putting a magnifying glass to his hypocrisy and the lack of a difference in your actions, purposeful or no. The second way to talk Ulysses down involves having a high faction reputation with either the NCR, Caesar's Legion, Vegas, or House. This dialogue tree centers around the courier's conviction in whichever nation they've chosen to bear the flag of, ultimately contradicting the very motivation behind Ulysses' actions. Ulysses respects these convictions and recognizes the sincerity of the courier, opting to stand down and allow them, should they manage to escape the divide, to continue on to Hoover Dam. The third method of talking Ulysses down is only available to players who've managed to find all of Eddie's upgrades throughout the divide. Doing so gives you the opportunity to show Ulysses that Eddie is in fact one of the only things left with records of pre-war America, a concept with which he is very familiar with in his glorifications of its symbol. The final method is to use his holotapes to remind him of the very question that he posed to the think tank in Big Mountain.
That question. Either you walked the big empty. You found the last of the holotapes.
Through this dialogue, you can convince Ulysses that to kill a symbol is to not give history a chance, and that it's on people like yourselves to change those symbols and bring new life to the places that you visit. I think that all of these endings do a great job at illustrating two of Ulysses' most pivotal character traits, his ability to listen and his glorification of symbols. Now sure, plenty of characters can be convinced to do something, to stand down, to consider an alternative, and so on, but Ulysses is the first character that feels truly defined by his receptiveness to information as a character trait specific to him, with it playing a major role in his development prior to and during Lonesome Road. It was this receptiveness that allowed him to ascertain such a complex understanding of the Legion's philosophies and their traditions despite not personally believing in them, or so we can at least infer. It was this receptiveness that made him such an effective scout in Frumentarius, which also led to the Legion's discovery of Hoover Dam, as well as the knowledge that Joshua Graham miraculously survived his plunge off of the Grand Canyon. Even long after the destruction of the Divide, upon meeting Christine in Big Mountain, Ulysses is seeking to understand both the Brotherhood of Steel and pre-war America. Even though Ulysses holds a profound grudge against the Courier and what they caused at the Divide, he's not so petty that he completely refuses to understand that he could be in the wrong. In fact, I think the sheer number of ways in which he can be convinced to step down is proof enough of just that. Though he will initially refute all of these reasonings, that's not to say that he'll continue to deny them when faced with a convincing enough argument, because Ulysses never lacked the ability to listen. That was Courier 6. What Ulysses lacked was the willingness to do so, at least regarding Courier 6. But what I believe to be Ulysses' most fatal flaw is his glorification of symbols. Ulysses is a man who puts a lot of value in the meaning behind symbols and how they can unite people to form entire nations and ideologies. To him, symbols are representative of the actions its followers take, and he seems to think that they become more and more concrete as they take shape. The NCR's two-headed bear is a symbol of a people that continue to fail despite how well-meaning they may be. The Legion's bull is a symbol of a people that continue to charge headfirst into conflict with no respect for history and a lack of perceptiveness regarding the future. Vegas is a symbol of a bygone era that's going nowhere. However, the most important symbol to Ulysses is undoubtedly that of the pre-war American flag. It's his attachment to this symbol that's the very driving force behind his character. To Ulysses, this symbol is a representation of history that was wrongfully taken away through fire and destruction. Initially, the symbol was one of the Divide, a nation taking its first breaths. A representation of hope that one day, surely things would become better and people could be united. Ulysses would then begin to understand the history of this symbol even more after listening to the think tank's descriptions of America, many of which we can assume were being conveyed through rose-tinted glasses given their characterization in Old World blues. The fact that the history of this symbol was so remarkably similar to what he understood about it would begin to shape Ulysses into a symbol of his own, whether he recognized it or not. Now bearing the old world American flag on his back, Ulysses stands as a representation of that which will not be snuffed out. America sleeps, the divide sleeps, and it's he that will carry those nations beyond the grave. To kill Ulysses means to kill not just what remains of the divide, but America as well. Or maybe this is just me falling victim to the very way of thinking that Ulysses himself abides by. The point here isn't that Ulysses oversimplifies others by reducing them to their symbols, but that the very act of reducing one to a symbol they bear further deepens existing division. If the courier is associated with the bear, the bull, or even the lights of Vegas, Ulysses will create a link between their history at the divide and the failures of those who stand beneath the flag they bear. If the courier stands for an independent Vegas, Ulysses looks down at the courier with a sneer for lacking any conviction, a trait not too dissimilar to the unwitting of the courier which led to the destruction of the divide. And it's by recognizing the courier's ability to bring about positive change, be that through the NCR, Vegas, the Legion, or even something entirely new, that Ulysses is finally willing to listen and step down. These two character traits are what define Ulysses, and their significance to this final confrontation cannot be understated. Ulysses is stubborn, he speaks with conviction and has a complex understanding of post-war Western America, both through his own experiences and by the acquisition of knowledge that very few will ever have access to. When speaking with the courier, Ulysses is firmly rooted in not only his hatred for the courier, but his disposition of the very symbols that dominate post-nuclear Western America. But Ulysses isn't so stubborn as to deny the truth in opposing perspectives, and he's perfectly capable of recognizing the importance of change. With enough conviction, the courier can dissuade him, and he'll admit the truth in their words. Without that conviction, Ulysses doesn't believe that the courier can bring about good change, and all that's left to do from there is fight. But regardless of whether or not Ulysses falls at his temple, the missile launch has already been initiated. At this point, it's on the courier to decide where those missiles go. They can be fired at either the NCR's only remaining supply line, the Long 15, the Legion-occupied dry wells, or they can fire at both. Though neither has particularly noteworthy in-game consequences, barring impacts on the player's reputation, which doesn't really make sense because how on earth would anyone else know that the courier launched those missiles? The implications are very much worth considering, even if there isn't additional ending slideshows to account for those bombings in the conclusion of the base game. Without the Long 15, the New Vegas chapter of the NCR is just as stranded as the Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel. Vertibirds can help, but it's going to take a long time to discover and develop a new path to run supplies between the Mojave and California. Assuming the NCR even managed to succeed at holding Hoover Dam against the Legion, and even with House out of the picture, maintaining that control over Vegas is going to be ridiculously difficult, even if we assume that the courier is some kind of bipolar flip-flopping freak that decided to be as helpful to the NCR as possible before abruptly bombing them, and then going on to help them claim Hoover Dam. Without a consistent source of supplies and reinforcements, even at its most efficient, the NCR will become even more reliant on Mojave locals for basic necessities, locals whom were already hard-pressed to even begin to tolerate NCR policies, and many of whom will continue to do so regardless of the efforts they make. This would ultimately lead to a great deal of infighting that would in turn most likely cause the entire operation to completely dissolve, especially if the Brotherhood and the Enclave are still around. And if we're assuming that more missiles were fired into deeper stretches of NCR territory, then it becomes all the more unlikely that they're able to reinforce and resupply Vegas for what is surely an indefinite period of time. The NCR is beyond fucked if this happens. As for Caesar's Legion, it's pretty easy to imagine how difficult things would become for them without dry wells. Dry wells is the Legion's primary route from the eastern states towards the Colorado River. The Legion is already spread way too thin, and another massive strain on resources will only make further expansion even more difficult. The only way this countdown can be stopped is if the player saved Edie prior to reaching Ulysses. By sacrificing Edie, the countdown can be stopped, the machine that destroyed the divide preventing the very same scar of land from creating yet another. The dialogue options here are a bit melodramatic, but it's a nice scene nonetheless. But regardless of whether or not you launch the missiles, Ulysses' temple will begin to explode, for some reason. I guess he rigged it to explode. Following this is the ending slideshow, which is relatively brief, but does a nice job at wrapping up the tales of Ulysses, Eddie, the Divide, and the Courier. There's even a cool Planet of the Apes Easter egg for those with the Wild Wasteland trait, though I will say it's more than a little bizarre how the tunnelers, you know, the Mojave's greatest threat, apparently began to act docile towards the Courier following their trek through the Divide. Weren't these things supposed to be a greater threat to Vegas than the NCR and the Legion? I was able to buy the ghost people behaving this way towards Christine because of how strangely intelligent they are, but the tunnelers are never characterized as having sapience, so what the fuck is going on here? Also, why the fuck do I need closed captions turned on to get a translation of what the fuck Edie is saying in his ending slides? Like, could you folks at Obsidian seriously not be fucked to just give a translation regardless of subtitles or closed captions being turned on? I'm sorry, but I don't speak Morse code. In any event, Edie essentially has 3 different endings. If the player saved Edie and fired the missiles, Edie continues his journey to Navarro, though it's implied that Navarro would have been obliterated by a missile from the Divide. If Edie sacrifices himself to stop the missiles, his data is transmitted to the iBot found in Prim. If Edie was never rescued from Ulysses' temple, then he's simply left to be destroyed along with the rest of the facility. Though it is worth noting that the first 2 endings I mentioned have a greater sense of optimism should the Courier have found all of the upgrades, with Edie pressing on with the strength and hope granted through his memories. Alright, I've been holding off on talking about this one for some time now, but it's time we finally tackled it. Edie is cute. Its innocence is a nice reprieve from the otherwise bleak setting that is the Divide. I like Edie, and I think most others do too. He's not much for combat, but being able to repair items, hold hundreds of pounds of equipment, and that adorable little beat boot makes him pretty endearing. But is it not strange the level of sentience that this thing seems to possess? Ignoring Fallout 4 because holy fuck does it eradicate any potential sense there was to be made regarding the sentience of robots, I don't think I can recall any other instance of sentient machines in this franchise. Securitrons operate using actual brains, so that's a bit ambiguous, but none of the purely synthetic machines in these games possess any degree of sentience beyond the illusions of sentience that personality modules would work to mimic. This is also why I'm disregarding androids, as they are very much in their own category of being. Robots like Mr. Gutsy and Liberty Prime were designed by red-blooded, anti-commie Americans, so it makes sense that they would possess hyper-patriotic personality modules. The devices of the Sync were designed by the madmen of the think tank, so yeah, that checks out. Mr. Handy's, no, not you Codsworth, get out of here, are meant to behave like a proper butler, so it makes sense that they would speak with an eloquence that gives off an aura of class and politeness. This brings us to Edie. On the surface, it would seem that Edie has simply been outfitted with a personality module to behave almost like a house pet, responding happily to positive reinforcement and cowering in fear at danger. That's all well and fine, but then there's the audio logs of Dr. Whitley, an Enclave scientist who seems to be under the impression that Edie is in fact a sentient being. How on earth does an Enclave scientist come to believe that an iBot possesses sentience unless Dr. Whitley himself in fact programmed the iBot to be sentient? But if he did, that opens up its own rabbit holes of questions regarding Whitley, so... But seriously, do you mean to tell me that Dr. Whitley found a way to give machines sentience?
It's alive!
Are we just going to pretend that that doesn't have insane implications regarding what could or could not be in this world? My brother and John Henry Eden, we have already faced nuclear Armageddon. We don't need a fucking Terminator situation leading to another. Moving on from that, after the ending slideshow, one last package can be found from Ulysses gifting a number of DLC items to the Courier, as well as one final holotape.
Last tape, last message. In case you best me. If you're hearing this, you have, through blood or word, this message and all that lies with it. It is for you, Courier. If you want to know the why of things. This world, I've walked a good part of it. I stopped only because of you. What you did gave me pause. Long ago, I crossed the Colorado, the first among the Legion to see Hoover Dam in all its glory. An old world wall, yet bridging two sides. And beyond it, a symbol of a two-headed bear. An idea great enough to challenge Caesar himself. Might kill him taking it, whether he won or lost. The bull needs to fight, needs the challenge. Without it, it falters, dies in the dust. Might be a lesson there in you and me. Leave the thought behind the message to you. My message is this. The destruction that has been wrought at the Divide, or elsewhere, if you can stop me, it can happen again. It will keep happening. If war doesn't change, men must change, and so must their symbols. Even if it is nothing at all, know what you follow, courier. Just as I followed you to the end. Whatever your symbol, carry it on your back and wear it proudly when you stand at Hoover Dam.
If the player convinced Ulysses to stand down, they'll be able to find him overlooking the Divide just before the entrance to Hopeville Silo. Ulysses talks a great deal about the Legion as well as the coming battle for Hoover Dam. The most interesting bit of dialogue, I think, is when he talks about what it might take to convince Legate Linnaeus to stand down, as Caesar will undoubtedly be calling on him for this second battle. And this actually opens up an entirely new dialogue tree when the player does come face to face with the legate himself. Though Ulysses does plan to stay for a while longer, where he goes from here is entirely on him, just the same as his fellow courier after Hoover Dam. This final lesson in the power to bring about change now weighing on the minds of both couriers, all that's left to do is part ways. Perhaps finding new homes for themselves somewhere out in America.